There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamma Mia podcast.
Mamma Mia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
The following episode contains discussions of violence. Listener discretion is advised. The small town of Mylor, buried in the Adelaide Hills, has a population of just over 1,000 people. Properties sit on sprawling bushland between the mountainous terrain, and today people visit to camp or see the native animals. It was October 1966 when 8-year-old Wendy Jane Pfeiffer, petite with short hair and rosy cheeks, decided to walk the family dog on a quiet Sunday afternoon. She took Bonnie, a brown and white farm dog, down a dirt track which has barely changed in 55 years. Wendy wouldn't come back that afternoon, or the next. A search began in the friendly rural village where bad things never happened. Pictures were circulated. Still, there was no sign of Wendy. Where had she gone? Who had taken her? And by some miracle, was it possible she was still alive? I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Kylie Boltin. Kylie is a Walkley Award-winning producer and journalist, and currently the TV commissioning editor at SBS and NITV. Her story, both written and an interactive documentary published by SBS titled Missing, tells the story of the abduction of 8-year-old Wendy Pfeiffer. Her work won numerous awards and shone a light on an otherwise invisible moment in Australian history. It's Sunday, October the 23rd, 1966. Tell me about the Pfeiffer family and what they did that day. How did they ordinarily spend a Sunday?
Well, every Sunday, the Pfeiffer family, of which there were 5, Wendy Jane Pfeiffer was 8 and she's the third of 3, they'd go in their Holden and drive to Hansdorf, which was the largest town in the vicinity, but that town is just over 1,000 people as well. So it's in the Adelaide Hills and it's very rural, but they'd drive there. It would take about 40 minutes to drive and they'd go to church. Hansdorf has a large Lutheran community and there are 2 Lutheran churches. The Pfeiffer family belonged to St Michael's Church. They'd sit at the rear of the church, as they always did, and listen to the pastor, Pastor Elmore Zweck. And when that was done, they'd get ready to go, they'd bustle into their car and they'd make one stop, and that stop was to get ice cream in a piece of paper and cardboard, which was their Sunday treat before they drove back home again.
And they went back to the home where they all lived. Can you describe the sort of town and what the feel of it was? Was it somewhere that was considered safe? What did it feel like? Because you actually went and visited, didn't you?
I did. I got to visit twice, actually. Mylor's really tiny. The houses are quite far apart from one another. It's a little bit more built up now because this is, many, many years after the events that we're talking about today. At that time, the roads were not sort of firm bitumen as they are now. It would be much more gravelly roads. It's surrounded by scrub. The house we're talking about, the family house, Willow View, looks very much the same as it did then. The gardening and the landscape might have changed somewhat, but the house itself, the bones of the house, the colour of the house, the feel of the house is very, very similar.
After that lunch on Sunday, what did Wendy decide to do?
Wendy, in her own words, was quite cheeky when she decided to take her dog, Bonnie, for a walk. And when I asked Wendy what sort of dog Bonnie was, it's just she's a farm dog. Wendy didn't want to stay indoors after she'd finished, and she didn't really want to do her chores, which would have been sort of feed the chooks and do farm chores. She just wanted to sort of go out and go for a walk and go with Bonnie, and that's what she did. She took a piece of twine, she put the twine around Bonnie's neck, she put on her red jelly sandals. She actually stripped off from her very kind of formal church gear, put on a skirt, T-shirt, red jelly sandals and headed out the road.
And when she was on the road, a car stopped. And as you say, it's quite a small area, so you would think you'd sort of recognise people. She didn't recognise this car that stopped. What did he ask of her?
The car stopped and pulled up on the same side of the road that she was. It was just at the intersection of her street and the sort of what you would call, quote unquote, now a sort of, it was an intersection, but it's still a very sort of small space, small intersection. He pulled up and he wound down the window and he asked her if there was a good place for fishing locally. And for Wendy, this was strange because there's not really any fishing around there. There is a river, and we can talk about that later, the Onkaparinga River, but it's not where you'd go for fishing. So Wendy, being 8, being a farm kid, feeling very comfortable in her environment, being surrounded by warm, open people, she answered him honestly and just said Silver Lake, which is what she knew in her 8-year-old mind is where you might go fishing. And she thought that was it.
And then what did the man in the car do to her?
So for Wendy, what happened next, it's hard for her to remember. Her words are that she was snapped up into the car. Going through the court transcripts, talking to her more recently, and as she tried to remember the events, he pulled her into the car, he pulled her over his legs, and he would close the door behind her. It all happened in a very quick moment of time. She doesn't recognise his face. She says she wouldn't recognise him if she saw him down the road. But after he stabbed her, she remembers, and she remembers now, the smell of blood that she said is very tangy. She remembers that now, and that is sort of her sense memory that can take her back to that moment in time.
This person has taken this 8-year-old who is, due home, and her family that afternoon recognised that she's gone. And one of the words that comes up in the family's mind is Beaumont, because the Beaumont children, of course, had disappeared not that long before. What was the Beaumont story and why was that something that sprung to mind for people in Adelaide?
So remembering this was 1966 and it's a very different time than it is now. Adelaide is a relatively small place in terms of population. It's a space where people feel safe walking around the street. But 10 months prior to Wendy's abduction, the 3 Beaumont children went missing. And at the time of Wendy's abduction, they still hadn't been found. So when the society, both in Adelaide and the Adelaide Hills, where this particular case is taking place, the Beaumont and the memory of the Beaumont, the knowledge that those 3 kids haven't been found is fresh in everyone's mind.
So I imagine that there's widespread fear pretty quickly, and a pastor who works at one of the Lutheran churches drives into his street and sees a car in his driveway that belongs to sort of one of the constituents at his church. What does this person say to him?
This is sort of day 2, if you think of it like that. So Sunday, she's missing from about 1:40 p.m. She leaves the house. The dog comes back, Bonnie, and no Wendy. That's when the family start to pay attention. They start to realise something's very, very wrong. They call the police, they call Stirling Police Station, and a search begins. So 150 people are looking for her at this stage. So to the point about the Beaumonts, that feeling of fear is so ripe in everyone's mind that straight away they want to find her. They get everybody. They get the volunteer searchers. There's a lot of volunteers in that area. They all come on board. The police come on board. The family's looking for her.
Is there any trace?
Well, not in the first instance. They don't know. They don't know where to look. So they're looking around the house. And in fact, media start to camp out on their house. The next morning, John, who's the eldest, he's 16 at the time, the eldest brother, he wakes up and he just feels this sinking dread, and he just has seen this sea of lights because all of the media have camped out at his house. And at that point in time, this sort of stuff didn't happen, that kind of big media scrum that maybe we're a little bit more familiar with today. And the timing is really interesting because in the 60s, in terms of how you talk to children and this kind of thing and how media talks to children, it's a very, very different time. But I guess the most important thing is everybody is very, very concerned that they find her as soon as possible. We know from all of our research, and the audience knows too, you need to find kids fast. You need to find people fast who are missing. And so that's what everybody does, and that community really comes together. But they don't find her. And so the next morning they wake up, and as John said, he just feels this sense of dread. She's still missing. At 8:30 in the morning, the next morning, Pastor Zweck, who is the St Michael's Lutheran Church pastor where the Pfeiffers go, he's coming back to his house. So I don't know where he was in the morning, could have been. He's coming back to his house and he sees a white Corona. Wendy in her testimony will say later that it's not a Holden. It's not as big as a Holden, and he's still driving that same car. He drives it outside Elmore's house and he tells him that he knows where this little girl is. And he said, I suffer from my head. My mind sometimes is a blank. And the pastor quickly connects the dots and asks if it's about the missing girl. It's all that's on anybody's mind. And Neville Dolling, who's a 22-year-old farmhand, had seen the searchers the night before. He'd seen the newspapers that morning. He knew that he had done something that he was very, very wrong, and he felt the urgent need to confess, and that's what he was doing when he went to the pastor the next morning.
What did he then do? Did the police arrest him? Was he able to take them to where he had abandoned her?
Yeah, I mean, it's unusual in the sense that the police had a confession, but they didn't have a body. So Neville Dolling was kept at the pastor's house. The pastor kept him talking. He actually made a call to the police, and the police were members of the congregation, and they said to the pastor, keep him talking. So the pastor sat him down and kept him talking, and then Dolling took the police to the place where he had left Wendy. Now, he firmly believed he had killed Wendy because he'd stabbed her and he'd left her for dead and she wasn't moving. And as far as he knew, she wasn't breathing. So in his mind, he'd killed her and he'd abandoned her in the scrub in the Adelaide Hills. When they got to the place that he'd left her, her body wasn't there.
Were there any traces? Was there any sign that she had been there?
Not necessarily signs because her body had been left there. They did find a red jelly sandal throughout the search.
Then it becomes this search for this little girl, not knowing where she could be. What did they decide to do next? So they've obviously got this massive search, and then they decide to bring two people on who know the land better than anyone. What do they bring to the investigation?
This is the morning of the second day, so it's the Monday morning. The whole day people are searching for her. These 150 people continue to search for her. They're combing the land. The archive at the time is amazing. They're kind of standing shoulder by shoulder and walking through the land, calling for her, looking for her, and they can't find her. Along the way, they do find some clues. And so two people who I was lucky enough to interview, Milton Boulderstone, who was 81 when I interviewed him, and Peter Lewis, who was 78. They'd been working the full day at the Boulderstones poultry farm, and they decided to help out. They found some prints the night of Monday 24th. The police were able to photograph those prints. And so they had a new lead, if you like. So it was the next progress of the lead. Now, the police wanted to call in people to find the body, essentially, okay, because she'd been missing for so long, they all assumed that she was dead. They decided to call in Jimmy James and Daniel Moodoo, two Pitjantjatjara trackers from the Riverland, two Indigenous trackers. And Jimmy James was the lead tracker, and he's been working with the South Australian Police altogether for 40 years. And he searched for murderers, he searched for missing people, almost 100 people over those 40 years. So he was very well respected. And they brought the trackers in to find her body. And so what those trackers did was they drove from the Riverland, they arrived in Mylor at 5:30 in the morning, and they set about looking for Wendy.
What did they find on the ground? Because there are some pretty incredible accounts of, you know, you and I may not notice a certain footstep or whatever it is in the land. What were these men able to determine from the area that would eventually lead them to Wendy?
In our research about tracking and talking to contemporary trackers who still work with the police now, or Indigenous elders who track, also Jimmy James's nephews who we spoke to, the art of tracking or the science of tracking is a combination of things. And I can't even begin to explain that because I'm not this person. But just as a researcher and having the opportunity to speak to people, it's a combination of understanding the land inside out. It's a combination of spirituality. It's a combination of intellect. It's a combination of common sense. And Jimmy James had all these skills, and he had them to an extent that possibly many, many other people didn't have. So Jimmy is able to come into this landscape. He's able to, first of all, see in Wendy he had a kindred spirit. He had a little girl that he'd call Little Fella as he was walking through the landscape. He had this little girl who was trying her hardest to survive, you know, a little girl who was respecting nature in the same way that Jimmy and Daniel would respect nature, a little girl who would be trying to find her way, trying to survive, trying to drink water when the opportunity came. If she found a river, she'd drink water. And everything that she did, he could see. He could see it because he could see the way the landscape had moved slightly, you know, or he could see the way that there might have been leaves that were indented in ways they shouldn't have been. When she got to the river, he could see outlines of her footprints. He could see that she had lost a sandal. He could see that a sandal was on the other foot and that she had a wounded foot. He could see where she slept overnight. because he could see that there was a house. Wendy, when we interviewed her, called it a little house, but really someone at one point had stayed there overnight, someone who was sleeping under the stars or whatever, that she had slept in this house. And just all of those signs from the land he was able to acknowledge and find. And he was able to move through the landscape in a way that many other people couldn't do because he had that extra skill that was to really kind of be in touch with the land that he was walking.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Jessie Stevens. I'm speaking with Kylie Boltin about the abduction of Wendy Pfeiffer. How had Wendy managed to survive? Because they are harsh conditions. By that stage, it had been 2 nights. An 8-year-old. How had she managed to survive with that level of injury?
So, she had a knife. The third stab had gone through half an inch from her chest, sort of 1.27 centimetres away from her chest. And even that, it's a huge testament to her that she was able to survive that. And in all honesty, when the medics had looked at her later, they all said she was very, very fortunate to survive on a physical level. It was near 0 temperature degrees. She was wearing, remember, a T-shirt, a skirt, bare legs. She wasn't prepared in any way, shape or form to be out overnight. How had she survived? Well, I think, interestingly, when you talk to her, she doesn't see herself as a victim or a survivor. She saw herself in an extension of her own landscape. So she wasn't scared of being in that landscape. And when you go there, it seems rough. It's beautiful and there are, birds and amazing plants and trees around you. But at the same time, if you come in with foreign eyes, it feels foreign. But if you live in that landscape, for her, it felt an extension of her home. She heard the same birds she heard down the road where she lived, she heard the same noises. There were some things that frightened her, and doing the research and the interviews and asking her what kind of noises might have frightened her, she thought it could have been a large bird, but it could very well have been searchers calling out her name. So there were sounds to her that sounded foreign and sounded frightening. And she then thought it was the monster, the bad man was back. So she got very frightened when she heard noises like that, which we think were people who were calling her name. But she's really adamant that for her, she just felt that she was home and she just needed to find her way back to her physical farmhouse. She felt very comfortable in the landscape. She just needed to find her way home.
When Jimmy was searching for her, I think I read that he could hear a sound that no one else could. They weren't sure what it was, but thought it might have been, an animal or something, and it was actually her crying. Do you think that she would ever have been found if it weren't for his work?
I don't think Wendy feels she would have been found if it wasn't for him. Wendy only agreed to tell me this story because she wanted to honour Jimmy. She really feels that he saved her life. She was very close to death. She was hypothermic. She was dehydrated. She had lost a lot of blood. And, she had been out for such a long time that it's very hard to know how much longer she could have survived. So the fact they brought Jimmy in, even to find her body, saved her life in the end.
He received an Order of Australia medal, didn't he, for that?
He did. For the service to South Australia Police, because he'd done so much service over 40 years. He'd won that medal. There's a statue of him in Rundle Mall that you can visit. And he was given a medal by Wendy's family, and sources close to him say that was his most prized possession. By all accounts, looking into this story, that relationship was hugely special for both Jimmy and Wendy. Jimmy respected Wendy and he respected her resilience and he respected the way she treated the land. And Wendy, the more she found out about Jimmy, because of course she didn't know that Jimmy was looking for her. It was only later that she understood. And as she grew older, she respected what he did more and more and more. So it's a beautiful story of two sort of unlikely protagonist heroes, because I do see Wendy as a hero. That was part of the reason why I was attracted to this story. She's not a vulnerable child in the bush. She's actually, a wonderful model of resilience and strength and potential, possibility, what can happen, what you can do even under the most arduous and horrible of circumstances.
When Wendy was found, it was, as you hinted at before, this unusual circumstance of a man has already been arrested in relation to her murder, which he thought he had committed, but this person was actually alive. What happened then? Was there a trial? What was expected of her to have to testify? What sort of happened next once she was found?
When you talk to her about when she was found, there was a scrum of media running towards her. So Jimmy held back, let her dad go up to her and sort of go to her gently, but there were a lot of media around. And when you see the archives of the time, there's this little girl with a blanket put over her with lots of cameras. And so this continued into the hospital. When she went into the hospital, still lots of media, lots of attention. And so that was in October. In December, Dollings was tried for murder and he was convicted of murder and sentenced for 12 years.
Wow.
The interesting thing is when you look at the trial transcripts, you realise that this 8-year-old girl was put on the stand and had to testify about her experiences. So you see this little girl trying to relive these experiences, talking about the car she saw, talking about how she told him about fishing, talking about being stabbed, that feeling, talking about the smell of blood. So a lot was asked of her at the time.
What sort of recovery did Wendy make, both physically but also psychologically?
So according to her, you just get on with it. She knows that she's lucky to be alive, and her entire life is a testament to that. She works very hard at her fitness. She paints. She's a staunch vegan. She's a very energetic and amazing person. And you do get that sense that she knows she's lucky to be alive. But at the time, in that house, in that context, in 1966, Mylor, it was very much you get on with it. So whether or not that was because the family had been under huge trauma and they didn't necessarily have the support structures at the time to deal with it, or whether or not it was just their personality, that they just get on with it. They've been through an ordeal. Everybody's safe. Let's keep going. They didn't have a lot of money. They were working farmhouse. They had a lot to do, lots of activities that needed to be attended to, lots of animals that needed to be fed. So at that period of time, she got on with it. She didn't talk about it. She was reticent to talk about it with us, but she did to honour Jimmy, which I think we've done. By doing that, we were also able to honour her, which I think is very special.
Finally, I wanted to ask, and you've touched on this, when you spoke to Wendy, why she wanted this story told, why she thinks it needs to be immortalised, and what drew you to this story of, as you say, these two heroes, I think.
Yeah. I'm at SBS and we have NITV as part of our family of content makers. And NITV talk about the need to have celebration within Indigenous communities. There is so much to celebrate. And when I found out about this story and I saw that Jimmy was a hero. I saw that Wendy survived. It just had all of these incredible ingredients for a truly epic Australian story. I just needed to tell that. And I knew that celebratory nature of it, even though it's a horrific incident, but it's more than that incident. And I think that was key for Wendy. She didn't want to be defined by that incident. For me, it was what happened afterwards, the fact that she survived, the fact that Jimmy came in, the fact that community gathered too to help try and find her. There's so many heroes in this story. And I think very much she wanted us to share his legacy. It was a huge privilege to speak to Jimmy James's nephews who were able to talk about their memories of him, talk about him teaching them how to track, to speak to Daniel Moodu's relatives, to know that there were these heroes that most Australians probably don't know about, to publish this story and to get feedback from the relatives of Jimmy saying, this is Jimmy's story, it's here, we've heard his story. And then also in the interactive that we made, I was able to commission Trevor Jamieson, who's an incredible Pitjantjatjara actor. He was in Rabbit Proof Fence and Storm Boy, amongst many other incredible movies. And he's a relative of Jimmy James. So he was able to bring to life Jimmy in a way that you could only hope to achieve. So on so many levels, this story just sort of gave so much.
How did you come across it?
So I'm lucky enough to work with a researcher called Deborah Schultz, who's just incredible. And she really went above and beyond when we were researching this story. So for the interactive, we really narrowed it down to both Wendy's point of view and Jimmy's point of view. But I was able to write the entire long read because we'd done so much work in advance, like over 6 months of research to find the people that were still alive who had participated, to find the newspaper archives, to find the TV archives. It was really, as I think she said in her own words, a Sherlock Holmes detective moment for her.
And what the story did as well was it was upon this backdrop. You have Jimmy finding this young girl, and the detail you included that this is at a time when Indigenous children are being taken from their parents. There is such a stark contrast there that is so, so sad. And the other detail that stuck out was about how much he was being paid to actually do that job, because As you say, a little girl could have died if it wasn't for him. How much was he being paid when he was doing this sort of service?
Yeah, I mean, researching it seems it was $7.25 an hour. I believe he was given a bonus of $500, but that was it, and no increase in wage occurred. So it's estimated that he saved hundreds of thousands of dollars in finding the people he did over that 40-year history. The wages is one thing. And the other point that you talked to, which was the context in which Jimmy grew up in his own life, he had tragedy, he had hardship in his own life, but he put all of that aside to do the work he did. Even within the police service, it seems that he didn't necessarily have the power or the authority he might have had in another circumstance. And even now, trackers aren't used in this kind of context because it's very hard to prove what they've done. So trackers can't come onto the stand because how do you cross-examine a tracker when it is a combination of so many things that we don't understand? So it was an interesting period in time that the people I interviewed, the police I interviewed who worked with Jimmy had so much respect for Jimmy, so much respect for Jimmy. It was incredible and really gratifying and really beautiful to hear. But that respect didn't translate to wages or even being called earlier on where he could have found her earlier. So it's a really complex time. And I think the point about children being taken at the same time is hugely poignant for us to think about, and to think about how he put all of that aside to do his job and find Wendy.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, we need more stories of heroes like this because there's no shortage. It's just whether we shine a spotlight on it, and you just did that so brilliantly. I can't believe I hadn't heard this story. It's incredible. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Kylie Boltin is the author and producer of Missing, an Australian true crime long read and interactive documentary by SBS on the abduction of Wendy Pfeiffer. You can find a link to Kylie's feature in our show notes, as well as Missing, an online interactive documentary. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Sound design is by Ian Camilleri, and our executive producer is Gia Moylan. If you'd like to find out more about the show, don't forget to join our online community. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook and make a request to join.